while everyone's starting to trickle in, I'll give a quick intro and then I'll hand over to Josie, who will get things started. So I'm Hilary and I'm Head of Marketing at Escape the City. Thank you for joining us today. I guess the purpose of this webinar is we have joined forces with On Purpose. And if you aren't familiar with what we do at Escape the City, we are the UK's leading purposeful jobs board. For the past almost 14 years, Escape has been connecting mission-driven job seekers with opportunities to make a positive difference, showcasing open roles at progressive organisations and programmes and courses to help people build fulfilling careers and do work that genuinely matters to them and to the world. So it made perfect sense for us to partner with On Purpose for the past few years, as their leadership programmes help people onto career paths that enable them to make truly transformative changes in the world through the work that they do. Which leads me into today's session, why we're all here. So thank you everybody for joining. The session will be exploring how individuals can start with themselves to make real change in the world. Now, it's not something that will happen overnight by any mean feat, but by asking questions that help to find your personal purpose, questioning the relationship between happiness, purpose and transformation, and thinking about how these relationships affect wider transformative change will all lead to a sense of clarity. Now, I won't take any more time away from our wonderful guest speakers, handing over to Josie to get started.
Thanks, Hilary. So I'm Josie. I'm the Marketing and Recruitment Coordinator for On Purpose London. Thanks for everyone for joining us. It'd also be great if, just while people are arriving and as we're doing some more introductions, if you wanted to introduce yourselves in the chat, who you are, where you're joining us from today. It's always nice to feel connected in that way. And just a little bit of housekeeping as well. So we'll be setting aside some time for your questions at the end. But if inspiration strikes at any point, don't hesitate to drop your thoughts in the chat or the Q&A function. We may answer some throughout. And Sarah from the On Purpose team, who's also kindly just put a message in there, is joining us, so she'll keep an eye on any coming through. And for anyone unfamiliar with On Purpose, we run leadership programs that help people to change the world through the work they do and the lives they lead. And our associate program is a year-long program that develops people to build the skills, experience and network to transition into purpose-led careers and create transformational change. And what we mean by transformational change is making significant, lasting and often profound shifts in how things work, pushing for entirely different and better outcomes. So I see someone's got their hand raised there.
I think someone's saying the chat is disabled or the Q&A is disabled. I'll just have a look into that.
Oh, perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So on to our speakers. So we're really delighted to be joined by two inspiring people who have embarked on their transformation journeys and are here to share their experiences and insights with us. So first I'll introduce you to Tom Rippon. Tom is an award-winning international social entrepreneur, speaker and writer, and he's the founder and CEO of On Purpose. And I'm also delighted to introduce you to Vicky Howard. So Vicky ventured from the world of advertising to the On Purpose Associate Programme in April 22. And since completing the programme earlier this year, she's been driving transformative change as the UK development lead at Climate Fresk. So huge thanks to all of you for joining us and to our incredible guests. Let's begin today's session. So to kick things off, I'd love to delve into the personal purpose-driven stories that have shaped both of your journeys. So how did you personally discover your purpose and how did it lead you to what you're doing now? Vicky, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thanks Josie. Hi everyone, lovely to be here. So I think I'm very early on in my journey and I wouldn't say I've really kind of discovered what my purpose is yet. Rather, I think this can be quite an ever-evolving, shifting thing. And so what I feel like I'm trying to do is live maybe more a purposeful life. And that's one where I'm kind of curious to learn and grow again. And so this need to do something more meaningful has always been in the back of my mind. But that compelling desire to act, to kind of proactively go out there and figure out what my purpose might be, has only actually really crystallized in the last year or so. And it really wasn't a light bulb moment, as you said, Hilary, earlier on. Like, it's been a really slow, meandering journey to get to this point where I felt like I really wanted to change the direction of my career and my life in general. But it's been punctuated by some very kind of key moments. The biggest one for me, I think, was that I was living in Abu Dhabi, working in the advertising industry, as you mentioned, Josie, when the COVID pandemic hit. And as my partner was a pilot, he unfortunately lost his job. And we actually then moved back to the New Forest in the UK, which, if you don't know much about the New Forest, it's this magical, really beautiful natural park in the south of the UK, and it's absolutely beautiful. So for this for me was a really kind of profound shift on many levels. I kind of was physically and psychologically moving from a desert landscape, a place where I loved the place, I loved the people, but I moved back home and I moved into a forest, and I started to kind of reconnect again to what it meant to like live in nature and to rediscover how beautiful the UK was. So again, I love my time in the UAE. I was very grateful for the opportunities I had, all the people I met. It's a really wonderful, inspiring country. But when COVID happened, I was kind of suddenly in this forest and I was reconnecting with nature. I slowed down a lot. I went for a walk every day and started to notice the incremental differences, like in nature growing and expanding, watching ferns and things like that. It was a really magical time. And I know I'm very privileged as well that I had that time to be there. I was working the land, I was growing trees, I was learning how to grow vegetables. So I really kind of connected back with myself and nature again. And I realized I wanted to look after the world. And secondly, I think I was feeling more and more underconfident at work and felt really scared about taking on more responsibility. I really kind of didn't want to take on leadership roles or take a much bigger step forward in my career. And I didn't really understand why that was happening. And so during one of the COVID lockdowns, I joined Upfront, which is a 6-week course that supports women and non-binary folk to learn about how to build their confidence. And the founder, Lauren Curry, she's a wonderfully inspiring woman. She describes the experience as feeling like a kick up the ass and a warm hug at the same time. And that really, really resonated with me. And it was definitely a kickstart I needed to kind of have the confidence to start exploring a new career path. So, I realized I wanted to switch up my career and I didn't really know what to do and where I wanted to go. And that's where On Purpose came in. And I literally typed more meaningful career into Google search and it came up. Great SEO, folks. On Purpose is all over Google. And I was very lucky to be accepted onto the program, and it really, really changed the way I see the world. I met wonderful new people, I explored new opportunities, and I came across completely different purpose-driven organizations that I would never have come across before, including Climate Fresk, where I am now. So that's kind of the journey that I'm on and where I've got to. And I never would have imagined, a year ago that I would be working in the climate change space doing what I'm doing now.
Thanks, Vicky. I think it's really beautiful and something quite profound when it's the reconnecting with nature. That's something that really kickstarts something. So thanks. Tom, same question for you.
Great, thank you, Josie, and lovely to be here as well. And lovely to see you again as well, Vicky. So the question of people often ask me whether I've discovered my purpose or how I discover how I have discovered my purpose. I'm never actually sure that I have discovered my purpose in that kind of sense, at least not in the sense that that it kind of implies that there is some kind of enduring, immovable purpose that you need to discover, and then that's it for the rest of your career or the rest of your life. I have certainly become over time clearer about what I want to do and what kind of contribution I want to make to the world of work, to maybe the world more generally as well. But actually for a long time, and I was originally a management consultant, for a long time, I was very unclear and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I had lots of people who were telling me, well, just do whatever you're passionate about. And I actually found that deeply unhelpful because it wasn't the issue that I didn't have anything I was passionate about. My issue was I felt there were just too many things that I was interested in, and could become, passionate about. And so people just kind of telling you to do whatever you're interested in, I frankly didn't find very useful. And I almost, in some ways, I can describe it sometimes, I almost became a bit paralyzed with the kind of the choice I had and trying to figure out what I should do. But luckily, I had someone at the time give me 2 very useful and very practical pieces of advice. And they were, the first is that, you're not having to decide what what you want to do for the rest of your career or the next 20 years. Actually, all you have to do is what you want to do. All you have to decide is what you want to do for the next 2 or 3 years, and that's plenty. And then, after 2 or 3 years of doing that, you can figure out whether you want to do more of it. If you want to do something else, that's fine too. And don't get too worried about the possibility that you might change after a certain time. So that was the first thing. Don't get too long term about this. The second one was that you're not going to figure out what you want to do by sitting in your kitchen or your bedroom or wherever, kind of writing long pros and cons lists. This is not an academic or an intellectual exercise. And in fact, what this person told me was, he basically said, go hang out with some interesting people. Go and find out where cool stuff is happening. Interesting organizations are doing things, whether that's going to some events, whether that's trying to get involved on a volunteering basis, whether that's trying to find some short-term projects, whatever it is, finding out what you want to do is a contact sport, not an intellectual exercise. And that was really helpful to me as well. And in fact, that's what I did. And amongst other things, the way I came to the idea of On Purpose, which a couple of years later I founded, was actually literally by helping someone write a business plan for something that was similar, but significantly different from what On Purpose does. But it was through helping out, through doing stuff, through interacting with people, through being in places where interesting ideas were happening, that I guess got my idea as well. And so eventually, as I say, 2 or 3 years later, I did start up On Purpose, and my purpose has evolved over the last 12 or 13 years since that started, and is still evolving as well, and I hope will continue to evolve. And so maybe in summary, just to say, one or two of the things that I hope the associate program does help people do is realize that those 2 pieces of advice that I gave, it's a contact sport, and you're not having to decide for the rest of your life, but also giving people room and space to experiment, and maybe a space to start, and it's a corny phrase, but to start a journey, because ultimately what I think uncovering purpose is not an end state you're trying to get to. It's a process, it's an evolution, it's a journey that you're on. And I think and hope the On Purpose program, the associate program, is a great place to kind of really get into that.
Amazing, thanks, Tom. Feels like quite common themes. It's the kind of way to, even if we don't frame it as discovering your purpose, but starting on that journey to work towards it is not sitting in an office, but either connecting with nature, connecting with people, which I think is really nice. So in terms of kind of moving on to a bit of a bigger question now, so is the pursuit of happiness or the pursuit of a greater purpose the key to a fulfilled life? And if you could share your views on how this relates to the transformation of organizations as well, it'd be really great to hear. If either of you want to kick us off.
I'm happy to jump in here. Yeah. And I actually really like this question, because even though it's like a really, really big question, it's definitely something that I've been asking myself a lot recently, especially as I think my life has gone through quite a dramatic shift in the last couple of years. As I explained, obviously I moved from one country doing one career, and I moved to the UK, and I was living in a very different environment. So, just the physicality of where I was and my headspace has changed. And I really tried to articulate that in my head, like, am I happier? Like, is this what I'm looking for now? Because I think there was a point where I decided, when I moved back to the UK, I'm going to put some intention behind this. I'm going to start to try and live a more fulfilling life through trying to discover my purpose, or trying to do something more meaningful, rather than just kind of pursuing happiness or just doing things that I enjoyed or took pleasure out of. So I guess I've got that contrast between those two things. That's a really nice question that you've asked now, Josie, because it's definitely something that's been going around in my head. I guess when I think about my life in Abu Dhabi, I was very, very fortunate. I had a very easy life. I was, didn't have to worry about money. I was jetting around the place, going on holiday all the time. I was eating in fancy restaurants, had lots of nice things. And on the surface, I felt like I was happy. I was having a really good time, had lots of good friends. But, it kind of felt quite shallow maybe, or a bit brittle, because there wasn't really anything sitting behind that. And I also felt this deep sense of emptiness. And I don't know, I mean, obviously Abu Dhabi is also a wonderful home for many people, but it didn't feel like my home. It felt like a transitionary period in my life. So I think a lot of it was probably linked to that as well. But I think a lot of the time I also felt maybe that I was living a bit of an egocentric life, one that was really centered on pleasure and self-fulfillment. And I wasn't really adding anything to the world. I was just taking. And that kind of made me feel quite uncomfortable. So then when I moved back to the UK, I really thought, okay, I'm going to try and pursue, I guess, what we define now as a life of purpose. I don't think I necessarily articulated it in that way at the time. But, yes, I've changed careers into the climate change space, but I'm also trying to kind of evolve my life and define my life with purpose in other areas as well. So I'm trying to live a bit of a lower carbon lifestyle. I'm trying to grow my own food and learn what it means to regenerate nature. So, I asked the question, is that making me happier? And I'm like, yes, in some ways it really is. I have a much, much deeper human connection with people in my life. I think after the On Purpose program, I literally hugged my dad for the first time ever as in my life as an adult. After we go through that kind of Mbekum retreat, if anybody does the program, you'll hear about it. It's a really special moment you spend with your cohort. So, I'm forming bonds with people that I didn't have before. And I'm also forming really deep connections with people at work. I'm in a much more open environment, like environmental space, where I feel like I can have much freer conversations with people. So, on that level, yes, I'm happier. I find more joy and beauty in the smaller things in life. I'm really trying to have an abundance mindset rather than one of scarcity, and scarcity. But my life is harder, personal transformation is really hard. Change is hard. It can be painful. It can be scary. You're going through lots of kind of questions and challenges and really digging deep about things that you might not have done before. And so, yes, it's hard, but also with that comes a sense of freedom and hope and possibility. And ultimately, I hope also that what I'm doing now is also having a positive impact on the lives of others. And it's not just kind of, fulfilling my own life as well. And then how that relates to organizations, I guess I thought about, this sense of it, change being hard. And that also really holds true for organizations. Simply sticking to the status quo can be really, really alluring, right? This sense that, they're just there to kind of make money and do what they do without considering the wider topics of the social environmental context that they sit within. But, if we want to live in a safe and livable collective future, we really need organizations to step up and really play their part in the transition. And so the current kind of system that that we're living in is really operating based on the premise that like economic growth is good and that making profit is the most important goal. And it's also quite a fairly simple goal. So it's just like a very singular goal, like let's make more money. And there's many proven blueprints out there in the world that show companies and businesses and organizations how to do that successfully. But, challenging the status quo is actually much more complicated and it's much more scary, and it's taking on big, complex, nuanced and social environmental problems. It's hard. It is hard. So, we understand why it is difficult for organizations to do that. But, it involves being brave. It means finding new ways of doing things, being creative with solutions, because there isn't really a one size fits all. But, as I was discussing with personal transformation, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's scary, but it can come to huge benefit for the people that work for those organizations. If an organization has a wider purpose and everybody's working towards that one purpose, it can bring everyone together and make people feel empowered to self-organize, to self-manage, to test and learn, to feel more resilient and really able to adapt to this kind of ever rapidly evolving world that we're finding ourselves in. So yeah, I think that's the way I looked at it in terms of like a personal journey being a little bit hard, and it can be taken through into organizations as well. But I think if you get through that, there's many positive things that come with it.
Thanks, Vicky. It's the kind of key thing, I guess, is about the easy route is not always the most rewarding route. Tom, do you have any reflections on this?
Yeah, thank you, Josie, and thanks, Vicky, for sharing. I certainly kind of empathize with the idea of it. It's hard. It's not necessarily easy, but somehow it ends up feeling, like you have a purpose. And in a way, I guess I'd kind of quite like to question the question, I suppose, or at least point out that there is an assumption in the question, which is that, you ask, is the pursuit of happiness or the pursuit of greater purpose the key to a fulfilled life? And the assumption behind that is that what we're trying to create is a fulfilled life. And that means our own kind of, personally fulfilled life, or at least that's one interpretation that I could put on that. Maybe different people will mean different things by that, but I think that's how a lot of people would think of it. And I guess I would kind of ask whether we can flip that around and say, well, actually, isn't it about having a purposeful life? And, so instead of everything being in service of fulfilling myself, actually everything is in service of the purpose, that whatever that is, that we're trying to get to. And that's, by the way, how Aristotle a long time ago thought about purpose as well. He said everything is in service of the kind of final end, as it were, which is the language that he used, but essentially the same as the purpose. So, this idea that actually it's all about fulfilling ourselves, fulfilling our potential, living our best selves, becoming the best we can be, all these kind of phrases that we have, they really come from a kind of 20th century phenomenon, which, in many ways is epitomized by the psychologist or psychiatrist Abraham Maslow, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, or many of you will have heard of, maybe Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, he put at the top of his hierarchy of needs self-fulfillment. So, and there was a whole kind of series of events in the 20th century that kind of somehow elevated this idea that, it's all about us being the best we can be and fulfilling ourselves. That's the most important thing in life. As a quick aside, I recently watched a fascinating documentary series, which is a kind of seminal documentary called The Century of Self, if everyone's ever interested in that, which kind of goes through from Freud in the early 20th century and charts exactly this kind of journey, how we became, well, quite self-obsessed, as the title suggests, The Century of Self. Anyway, that's a quick aside. I actually prefer the kind of the approach that a different psychologist takes, who was around about the same time as Abraham Maslow, so in the first half, mostly 60s, 70s of the 20th century. He was called Viktor Frankl, and he was a survivor of the concentration camps in the Second World War, and he founded what was kind of called the third school of Austrian psychology. And he had an interesting phrase, which I like to quote, which he said, "The pursuit of happiness is a contradiction in terms." So pursuing happiness, actively trying to make happiness happen, is a contradiction in terms. He says, happiness can't be pursued. It has to ensue from the pursuit of something that is greater than yourself. So in a way, what he's saying is happiness is actually only ever going to be a byproduct of doing something else, and of having something that is outside of yourself, that is beyond yourself, that is bigger than yourself, whether that's another person, whether that's a cause. And that idea of something beyond yourself, people slightly technically use the phrase self-transcendence, which, literally speaking, literally means going beyond yourself. And so it's this kind of self-transcendent quality, which we, or certainly I, On Purpose, kind of think about, and we associate with that with what purpose is. So pursuing happiness itself won't make you happy. Pursuing a purpose, I'm not sure whether it'll make you happy. It may or may not. As Vicky says, in some ways it's quite hard, and so it's not guaranteed that it'll make you happy, but at least I think you'll know why you're doing it. And then maybe just a kind of word on organizations as well. I think that same idea of self-transcendence, of going beyond yourself, can be applied to organizations too. And at the moment, in our economic system, it's very explicit that organizations, companies are expected to self-fulfill. They are expected to maximize their profits, or, slightly more technically speaking, to maximize shareholder value. Now, I actually believe that organizations, just like people, if they want to genuinely have a purpose, need to self-transcend. So they need to be able to articulate their purpose, not in terms of what it's going to do for me as an organization, but actually what contribution am I going to make there out in the world? What's the thing that's bigger than me, beyond myself, that I'm going to make a contribution to? What am I as an organization in service of? And by the way, that also includes what am I contributing to, maybe in an unintended way as well. And that for me is the key to thinking about purpose. So it's first about thinking about what's my contribution, and then only after that, the self-fulfillment, maybe therefore the financial, commercial success, etc., will follow. And by the way, it may not be massively lucrative. It may just be viable. But if you're doing it for the right reasons and you've got a real kind of contribution that you're making, then actually being viable, in my book at least, is enough.
Thanks, Tom. I think that was really inspiring, and talking about going beyond yourself and happiness maybe being a byproduct. And Vicky, it kind of sounds like some of the things that you've had, through doing the associate program and doing something that you find more purposeful now with Climate Frescoes, maybe living proof of that. So yeah, great to hear. Thanks both for sharing. So moving on to our next question then, kind of continuing on to focus more on organizations. So do you think organizations and businesses, can they transform themselves to be more purpose-driven, and how does this align with the broader goal of systems change?
I'm happy to jump in on that one if that's helpful. So I generally think they can, and there are organizations out there right now doing it, and organizations out there right now that have started up in kind of transformed ways, as it were, as well, who are starting from a different place from right at the beginning. For me, in a way, the question becomes less, are organizations doing it, or is it happening, but actually more to what extent are organizations doing it? And are they being sufficiently bold in trying to transform themselves? What I see quite a lot of still is organizations that are trying to have their cake and eat it. They want to be seen as being very purposeful and financially more successful than everyone else. And that, to me, doesn't really work with that idea that we were just talking about now, which is, you can't pursue happiness. You shouldn't really pursue profits for their own sake. You should be pursuing the purpose, the contribution you're making. The other things, will then hopefully ensue, will then hopefully come from that. So again, sometimes organizations will find a really valuable purpose, and that'll be commercially really valuable to them. That's great. Sometimes they'll find a really valuable purpose, and it's a real struggle to make it work, and maybe doesn't even work completely commercially. Maybe you need some subsidies, maybe you need some government help, maybe you need some grants. I think that's fine too, as long as what you're actually trying to achieve, as long as your purpose is valuable and making a contribution that we need. So what does it take to kind of, what kind of organizations are doing that, I suppose? And I think one framework that we use a lot on purpose, which is a well-known kind of systems change framework, is called the iceberg model. And it's basically based on the fact that, as many of you I'm sure know, if you see an iceberg, what you see above the waterline is probably only about 10% of the iceberg. There's an awful lot going on below the waterline. And in organizations, and also in psychology, people will kind of use that analogy to say, well, what we see above the waterline, the 10%, those are kind of the events. That's what happens. That's maybe how people behave, how organizations behave. But below, there are kind of several more layers of the iceberg which are not as visible. So below the events are kind of patterns. Sometimes you get events that occur every time. we kind of know this one happens all the time, and that we can kind of spot those patterns, and they underlie some of those events. And then below the patterns again, we have structures and processes. A lot of those patterns are brought forward because of how we structure ourselves, what processes we put in place. And then at the very bottom, importantly, of the iceberg, and critically, are actually kind of the beliefs and the values that underpin, our worldview, that underpin how we see the world, what we believe about the world, how we understand the world. And critically, when we talk about transformation on purpose, transformation means change that happens at that very bottom level of the iceberg. So we believe that unless, something about your, quite deeply held beliefs, values, way that you see the world changes, the change that you're going through is probably less likely to be bold enough, and certainly also less likely to kind of stick for a longer amount of time. And that holds true both for individuals and for organizations. So when we're looking at organizations and looking at, which are the ones that are transforming themselves, we're really looking, I'm always on the lookout for organizations that are doing things, with kind of counterintuitive or odd beliefs, or they kind of say things that you wouldn't expect a company to say. And just to give you one quick example of that, there's a wonderful furniture company called Vitsoe, Vitsoe, and their purpose, or they may call it their mission, I'm not sure, is that they say they want to help as many people as possible lead better lives by selling less stuff. At some level, we kind of go, that sounds all very sustainable, it all makes very sense. But actually, if you just pause for a minute and think, well, actually, a company that is actively trying to sell less stuff, that's really weird. If you go to business school, no one will tell you to try and sell less stuff. And yet, Vitsoe goes to genuinely quite long lengths, or puts in place all kinds of things to try and make sure that its customers buy as little things from them as possible. I won't go into all the detail now, but if people have more questions about that, happy to talk about it later on. So that's a classic example, I think, of where a company is being transformative because they've got a different belief that we can do business and not try and maximize how much we're trying to sell. And you might say, well, that's all very well, but that's just one company. We've got this massive kind of economic system that we need to transform. How's that ever going to work? But I strongly believe that there are actually more and more companies that are trying to do things really differently, not just companies, organizations in general as well. And the more we actually talk about them, the more we learn about them, the faster the news will spread. I think once you know that there are companies out there that are trying to sell less stuff, it's such an obvious thing that I hope I've already kind of planted a seed in all your heads that you might be on the lookout for that kind of thing. There are other companies in other industries that do the same thing. And before you know it, you kind of get, you can get people starting to believe that actually you can do things differently. And, another kind of systemic change concept is that of a tipping point, which I'm sure you've all heard about before. But, the amazing thing about tipping points is that you actually don't need a very large proportion of a population, whether it be an industry or society or an economy or an organization for that matter, to start changing something or to act and behave differently in order for the whole organization suddenly, or the whole community or the whole society suddenly to flip into different ways of doing things. Numbers vary. I've read numbers ranging from 10% to 25%, but it's a minority of people that need to happen. And so I think, talking about these amazing companies that are doing things very differently, maybe quite surprisingly, the more we talk about them, the more we can spread the word. We don't need to get to all that many of them. And then I'm convinced that we'll tip over into a genuinely different way of doing business.
Thanks, Tom. I really like the kind of idea of the kind of more we talk about things, having that ripple effect. And, even just so we've got everyone who's joining us today, and kind of hopefully is going to go on and talk about this after and pass on, all the businesses that are doing good, then it's the start of that ripple effect, dropping that pebble in the water. Vicky, would you like to share your thoughts?
Sure, yeah. I mean, what I'm going to say is going to follow on very directly from what Tom just said, in that my current organisation that I work at, they actually have kind of found their vision on this idea of tipping points. So at Climate Fresk, we actually believe that when we empower enough people and organisations across the world to take meaningful climate action, so that means, they know about the climate science, but they're actually out there changing their lives, changing businesses, changing, whatever it is on an individual or collective level, then we'll reach that social tipping point. And so, we can then shift the entire system so that everybody's actually working towards a low carbon world. And the way we do that is by taking people on a transformative learning journey. So in just 3 hours, the collaborative Climate Fresk workshop teaches the fundamental science and a systems view of climate change, and really empowers a group to take action. And then people can then train to become a facilitator. So you get this train the model. So then they can run workshops themselves and creating that kind of exponential transformation impact. And that's how, that's what the vision is for Climate Fresk, is that we actually reach this social tipping point because we empower other people to be trained up and to be able to spread the word, as you just said, Josie, to get this kind of ripple effect. And we actually run this workshop in kind of all types of organizations, in businesses, governments, universities. And it really does have the power to inspire change, at both the individual and collective level. So it's kind of giving people the understanding of what the system is through the workshop itself, but then actually empowering people to use that transformative learning experience to then inspire others to take transformative change themselves. So I feel like it's very relevant to what Tom was just saying, and to really give you a sense of scale of what, of how Climate Press can reach organizations. Businesses like EDF are using the workshop to engage their entire workforce. So that's 165,000 people in climate issues. So that every single person in that organization is not only driving change, in their role at work to reduce their carbon emissions in their kind of day-to-day job, but also really considering outside of their life, like, what does it mean as me as a citizen? What does it mean as me in my community to reduce my carbon emissions as well? So, that's where we really get this kind of systems change in action, I guess.
Thanks, Vicky. So yeah, that's been really great to hear your insights on kind of organizational change. I'd like to maybe take a kind of step back on the more granular level now, because I'm sure many of us here today share the desire to make a positive impact, but kind of reshaping entire systems can appear quite daunting. So would you be able to share some of your self-transformational steps that individuals can take to contribute to wide-scale change?
Shall I go first, maybe?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
I was trying to find the mute button, but yes, you go first.
I win. So I guess, this whole webinar, right, is about, leading change by starting with yourself. So I think, that's like the first place that you can start is with yourself and kind of figure out what your core personal values are. So I know Tom's been talking a lot about kind of challenging and changing and shifting our core values and belief. But I think, a very good starting point, especially for me, was to actually even figure out where you're at now, start to dig deep and figure out what are actually my core values. Because sometimes it can actually be that you hold a value that is maybe a good value, it's a valuable one, but you're just not really behaving in alignment with that value across all aspects of your life. So to give you a bit of kind of context in that, in my life, I always knew deep down, I just had this sense of, this gut feeling that working in advertising just didn't align with my personal values, but I couldn't articulate why. I never actually bothered to work out what those values were and why it really kind of felt fundamentally really uncomfortable, unmotivating, and probably ultimately quite soul destroying for me to work in that space. Personally, I don't overly value material things. I like to buy secondhand vintage clothes. I like to repurpose things. Outside of my career, I was living this kind of, more frugal life, but I was working in an industry that kind of actively encourages people to buy more and more stuff. And, I was promoting and even glamorizing really overconsumption, something which I now realize is really, one of the root causes of our kind of global and climate and ecological breakdown. And so when I really spent time to kind of define what my values were and beliefs, I really understood that actually what I was experiencing was quite a serious level of cognitive dissonance. I believed one thing deep down, I held this really deep value belief, but I was doing the complete opposite in my career particularly. And so I guess the question is, so how can my personal realization contribute to then a wide scale change? So for one thing, when I kind of realized what was going on, I started to dig a little deeper and I started to understand more about the issues of overconsumption and waste. And this then led me to learning about the wider system that I existed in, right? So I came across this concept of the circular economy model, something that Tom was just kind of referencing now with the company. And this is a system where materials basically never become waste and nature is regenerated. And so, the more I learned about this and the more I could articulate this concept and I had language for it, I felt empowered to then start making more significant lifestyle changes in my life, elsewhere in my life. And I really wanted to implement circular, I'd learned this new term, circular principles everywhere in my life, because I had this thing that felt like I understood and it made sense to me now. And so actually, when I was on the Purpose Programme, it really wasn't a surprise that, one of my placements was at an organisation called ReLondon, which is a partnership of the Mayor of London and London's boroughs to improve waste and resource management to accelerate our city, basically, to a low carbon circular city. So they really help businesses, organizations, governments at kind of a systems change level to start incorporating circular economy principles across all the activities that they do. And my actual role was to support SMEs to help transform the way they actually do business by kind of translating circular principles into business opportunities. So, you know, if you look back at like that journey I've been on, I've gone from me being like, I don't enjoy what I'm doing in advertising. Why is that? And really figuring it out, to actually then, you know, engaging in this much wider system and then working for an organization that then helps other businesses and organizations use that kind of different model. So I think that's just one example of how you can really spend a year or so going through a process that leads you to a much bigger impact that you can have in the world. And I just wanted to say as well, on a more practical note, maybe just some kind of practical steps that people can take around how to start to engage with like what their core values might be, or how they can start discovering their purpose. So one of the things that we were taught about on the On Purpose program was the Ikigai concept. So this idea of, it's a Japanese concept that means your kind of reason for being, and it really helps you figure out your purposes by defining what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and in a career context, I guess also like what you can be paid for. Having a coach really helps. So I know that comes with the On Purpose program, but if you can even get at least one session of coaching, that really helps you personally to like figure out what those values might be. Obviously apply to On Purpose. I'm always going to recommend that. But also I think just joining maybe a local volunteering community, or just engaging with different groups of people in things that you might be interested in, to really get a sense of like how people are doing things differently, in maybe the social or environmental impact space, depending on what you fancy, you know, what really it brings you alive. And obviously, one last plug, if you're obviously interested in kind of climate issues and transformational change at that level, then join a Climate Fresk workshop, because that's a 3-hour experience where you might feel that transformational change happen and come alive.
Amazing. They're great. They're the great points, Vicky, and I think definitely something that our audience can take home. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. That's an amazing list of things and a great explanation. So I don't want to kind of go on for too long, but maybe just say that, you know, just like we were talking about the organizations and that iceberg model, humans have that same iceberg. And, you know, we do believe that it's about trying to uncover and ask yourself questions about those very kind of deeply held beliefs and values. I think that's what Vicky was describing when she says, you know, there was this cognitive dissonance. And to some extent, I think you actually have to be kind of up for embracing some of that cognitive dissonance, or even creating some of it, actually, and exploring what is it and why does it come about and what's creating it. And kind of questioning yourself, you know, and being open to the fact that maybe some of your values and beliefs, worldviews, you know, need changing a little bit, or need adapting, or need updating. I'll just give you one kind of, you know, small example actually from one of our colleagues. We were having a bit of a discussion about different values that are very influential in our society and in our economy. And one of them was actually meritocracy. Now, meritocracy, I'm sure many of you are aware, is the concept that, you know, people should be rewarded according to, you know, their merit, as it were, and their merit is usually kind of thought to be related to their success, or at least the effort that they put in. Now, one thing that I think is fascinating is that the person who coined the word meritocracy was actually a serial entrepreneur before the word even existed. A serial social entrepreneur, so I should say. He actually wrote a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy in the late 1950s or 60s, I'm not quite sure now. But this book was actually a dystopian future, you know. So he was saying, actually, if we get to be a meritocracy, that's a really bad thing. And there's all kinds of reasons why that's the case, and we needn't go into those now. But it's just one of those examples where we suddenly kind of go, oh, hang on, this thing that we all just think of as being, yeah, obviously that's a good thing. Meritocracy is how we should organize ourselves. That's fair. Actually, that doesn't have to be the case. And maybe there are different ways of doing things. And I remember my colleague kind of saying, yeah, it was a real moment for her when she kind of went, oh, yeah, maybe that's not just such an unalloyed good. Maybe we could do other things. There are places in our society where we don't operate meritocratically. So, for example, you know, if you pick juries, you don't You don't have to be good to be in a jury. You just, it's fairly random. You kind of do a lottery system. And, I don't think we'd ever kind of think of picking a jury in a meritocratic way. So, and I think part of the On Purpose program is to do two things. Partly is to allow people to maybe sit with those dissonances and explore them and understand what they are, and have the support, and not just of coaches, but like really importantly also of other people on the program, your peers, which is amazing. And kind of come to some of your own conclusions around these. There's rarely right or wrong answers. And then the second thing is, and so to allow people to come out with, a somewhat changed set of ideas and beliefs. And then the second thing is, if you can also equip people to be really good at making change happen in organizations. And so the combination of people who think a bit differently and who are really good at making change happen, we think that's a really kind of explosive, in a good way, combination. And I think in some ways that's a simple way of summing up what we're trying to do on the program.
Amazing. Thank you both. I think there's a lot to take in there that everyone can hopefully relate, or kind of start with something from that. So that's the end of the questions from our side. We have a bit of time now for some questions that have been coming through. So just checking the Q&A, I've got Vicky, one for you directly from Emma. Vicky, I really resonate with your experiences and transformation. I'm very interested in Climate Fresk too. I wondered what your role there entails, if you could share a bit more about your position.
Sure. So it's actually a global NGO, and there is a whole team in France. Originally, it was a French organisation. And so my role, or at least like my predecessor actually on Purpose, but a couple of On Purpose placements have been piloting almost what it means to have a permanent person in the UK to help develop the community here. So we have a big community of facilitators who run the workshops, kind of a lot of volunteers, so supporting the volunteering community, but also kind of, collaborating and prospecting and working with universities and businesses and kind of spreading the word of Climate Fresk in the UK. So currently the project means that most people around the world, there's big communities around the world that are driven by volunteers, but France has started to explore, how much more impact can we have? Like, how can we accelerate the impact we have with this project if we put people in kind of paid permanent positions? So it's a very exploratory role. A lot of it is kind of community building and mobilizing freskers and working with my community, and a lot of it is working with external people, getting big visibility moments. So doing PR, running social media campaigns, kind of that side of networking. So it's a real mix. I wear lots of hats. I'm running around doing lots of things, but it's fun. And it's a real test and learn approach. So I really get the chance to practice things in a really safe environment. We've learned a lot about the agile technique and On Purpose, where you can fail once, but you can fail quickly and fail fast. And that's okay, because it means you learn quickly and then you can move on to the next thing. So it's a really kind of exploratively, it's a playground really that I get to have fun in.
Thanks, Vicky. I think we have time for one more question, conscious of coming near to the end. So this is from Erica. So this could be for either of you. How can I apply transformative language in communication to impact social change while working in an NGO?
I can try and give that a little bit of a go, Erica. There's a couple of things go through my head, I suppose. So one is, again, related to what we've already been talking about. You need to try and get to that, that kind of deep level of values and beliefs and what people, how people see the world. And one very simple way to do that, although it can sometimes be a bit annoying, you end up like this kind of 5-year-old child, is just to ask why lots of times. When is a what? Why do we do that? Why do we do it that way? And then they give you an answer, and you go, well, why again? And by asking, why 3, 4, 5 times, you start getting to some of those really deeper kind of underlying reasons. And then having a conversation at that deeper level is often, I think, more kind of useful and more likely to, any one conversation is unlikely to be transformative in itself, but it's likely to be maybe adding to a kind of transformative process overall. So that's one thought. The second thought, I suppose, is what we are trying to learn more and more about, and I guess it's language that we're trying to get to know, but it's not just language, it's actually more about concepts and ideas and importantly how to do things, is how systems change happens, and in order to kind of understand better how, to understand more about systems thinking. And systems thinking, very simply, is essentially a way of being able to make change happen in complex situations. And I think in kind of a lot of NGOs are working in very complex situations, a lot of kind of big social problems that they're tackling by their very nature are very complex. So I'd suggest go out there, find some more resources, find out a little bit about systems thinking. There's lots of people out there who offer things, there's online stuff, etc. All come on the On Purpose program and you'll learn about it there as well. So that's the second thought. And then the third one is very, very brief, is I actually think talking about it is important and the language is important. But I think even more important actually is doing something and doing something differently, and trying things out. And to Vicky's point, experimenting with stuff, even if it's maybe going to fail. But, I think ultimately also when you're trying to persuade people to maybe do something differently, having an experiment to be able to point to, or having actually done something differently, is always going to be quite a lot more compelling than trying to, in a way, only persuade them through language. You obviously need both, but don't neglect the kind of doing.
Could I just add one tiny part to that, Tom, as well? So in the Climate First workshop, we talk a lot about the head, heart, hand model. So this is, and you can apply that also into kind of communications and how you talk about what activities you're doing in whatever kind of environment. But the idea is you engage people on an intellectual level, but they won't actually then act. As you said, they won't do anything until you engage with them on an emotional level. So you really have to bring that kind of intellectual mind through the emotional part and really engage people's hearts, because then they'll feel compelled to act. So just with knowledge alone won't get people to change their minds or do things differently. So I think head, heart, hands is always a nice way a framework to think about communication on that level.
I love that, thanks. Also, I'm just apologizing, I think someone's just started drilling next door, so don't know if anyone can hear that. Apologies if so. But yeah, thank you so much. I think we don't have any more time for further questions. But there's so much to take away there in terms of purpose, taking steps on our own transformation journeys, as well as changing organizations. And before we wrap up, I'd just like to highlight that the associate programme is currently open for applications to start in our April 2024 cohort. So if you're eager to take your first step on a journey of self-development and contribute transformative change, could be the opportunity you've been seeking. You can find more information on our website at onpurpose.org, and do connect with us on LinkedIn and Instagram. If you just search for On Purpose London, you'll find us. And if you've got any other questions, you can reach out to us via email at recruitment@onpurpose.org. And the deadline for applications is the 23rd of October. So lastly, I'd just like to express my immense gratitude to our guest speakers, Tom and Vicky. It's been amazing. And yeah, for generously sharing your expertise with us. To Hilary and the team at Escape the City for co-hosting and providing all their support along the way. And to everyone who's attended, you've been an amazing, engaged audience, really appreciated it. So that's it from us. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks.